My name is James Cole, and I never thought a routine doctor's appointment would be the moment that changed everything. Not just my health, but my entire life. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October. It's a kind of morning where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or just hang there, gray and heavy like a thought you can't finish. I had been putting off this checkup for almost 2 years. Mom had been calling me every few weeks, reminding me, and my best friend Dana had started sending me calendar invites as a joke. But it wasn't funny anymore when I woke up one morning. I couldn't catch my breath walking up the stairs of my own apartment. I was 31 years old. I worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized advertising firm in Chicago. My life, from the outside, looked perfectly fine. I had a decent apartment in Lincoln Park, a job I was good at even if I didn't love it. A small but loyal circle of friends, and a golden retriever named Biscuit who thought I was the greatest human being who had ever lived. From the outside, everything looked okay. But I hadn't been to a doctor in so long that my old physician had retired, and I had to find a new one. Dana helped me look up a general practitioner named Dr. Marcus Webb at a clinic not far from my apartment. His reviews were good. Patients described him as thorough, kind, and easy to talk to. I made the appointment mostly to get my mom off my back and partly because the stair incident had scared me more than I wanted to admit. I remember sitting in the waiting room that morning, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading. The clinic was warm and smelled like lemon cleaning solution. There was soft jazz playing somewhere. A toddler in the corner kept stacking plastic blocks and knocking them over, laughing every single time like it was the funniest thing in the world. I watched him for a while and thought about how simple joy used to feel when the nurse called my name. I followed her back through the hallway and into an exam room. She took my blood pressure, my temperature, my weight, and asked me a list of standard questions. She was cheerful and efficient and left me sitting on the paper-covered exam table listening to the crinkling sound it made every time I shifted my weight. Then the door opened. Here and Dr. Marcus Webb walked in. I don't know exactly what I expected. I had seen his profile photo on the clinic's website, but photos don't always prepare you. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders and a calm, unhurried way of moving that made the room feel smaller and somehow safer at the same time. He had dark brown skin, close-cropped hair, with the faintest touch of gray at the temples, even though he couldn't have been much older than me, and eyes that were a shade of brown, so warm they almost looked amber in the fluorescent light. He was wearing a white coat over a navy blue shirt, and his stethoscope hung around his neck like he'd been born with it there. He looked up from the tablet in his hand and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes without any effort. "James Cole," he said. "That's me," I said, and my voice came out slightly higher than I intended. "I'm Dr. Webb. Marcus." He extended his hand and I shook it. His grip was firm and steady. "So it looks like it's been a while since your last physical. How are you feeling today?" "Honestly, a little nervous," I said. "But I'm fine. I think I'm fine." He pulled up a stool and sat across from me, not standing over me the way some doctors do, making you feel like a problem to be solved. He sat at eye level and gave me his full attention. And that small thing, that one simple gesture, made me feel like I could actually tell him the truth. So I did. I told him about the stairs. I told him I'd been more tired than usual, that sometimes my heart felt like it was skipping a beat. Not the romantic kind, the alarming kind, and that I'd been getting headaches. That I kept blaming on screen time, but that felt different from tension headaches. I told him I hadn't been sleeping well, that I'd been stressed. He listened to all of it without interrupting, wrote things down, asked follow-up questions that were specific and thoughtful. Then he examined me, checked my heart, my lungs. My reflexes looked in my ears and eyes, and through all of it, he was calm and methodical, and somehow managed to make the whole thing feel less clinical than it usually does. "I want to run some blood work," he said when he was done, "and I'd like to order a chest x-ray and an EKG. Some of what you're describing, the breathlessness, the irregular heartbeat, the fatigue, those are things we want to rule out carefully, rather than assume. Is it serious?" I asked, and I heard the tightness in my own voice. He looked at me directly. "I don't know yet. That's why we're running the tests. What I can tell you is that you did the right thing by coming in, and I'm going to take care of you, okay? I don't know why those words hit me the way they did. I'm going to take care of you, maybe because I'd been taking care of everything alone. For so long that the idea of someone saying that so simply, so plainly, knocked something loose inside me. I nodded and said okay, and pretended I wasn't fighting the strangest urge to cry in a doctor's office in the middle of a Tuesday morning. The blood work and tests were done that same day. Dr. Webb told me the results would take a few days and that he would call me personally when they came in. I thanked him, put my coat back on, and walked out into the gray October afternoon feeling lighter somehow. Even though nothing had changed yet, he called 3 days later. I was at my desk at work, staring at a logo redesign project I couldn't focus on when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I picked up and heard his voice, and something in my chest moved in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. James, it's Dr. Webb. Do you have a few minutes? Yes, of course, I said, and I stepped out of the open office into the hallway, my heart already picking up speed. He walked me through the results carefully. My cholesterol was elevated. My vitamin D was critically low. My blood pressure was higher than it should be for my age. And the EKG, that was where things got more complicated. He explained it to me in plain language. There was an irregular pattern in my heartbeat that needed further investigation. It's not necessarily dangerous on its own, but something that required a specialist's attention. He had already spoken to a cardiologist he trusted and had flagged my case. What does this mean? I asked. It means we caught something before it became a much bigger problem, he said. That's a good thing, James. A really good thing. I know it's scary to hear this, but the fact that you came in when you did that matters. I was quiet for a moment. I kept putting it off, I said. I almost didn't come, but you did, he said simply. I stood in that hallway for a long time after we hung up, back pressed against the wall, looking at the ceiling. My mind was running through 100 different worst-case scenarios. But underneath all of that fear, underneath the calculations about insurance and specialists and what would happen if something was seriously wrong underneath all of it, there was this strange, quiet awareness that something about that phone call had felt different from what it was supposed to be. Something about the way he spoke to me, the way he said my name, the way he stayed on the line a little longer than necessary, asking how I was doing emotionally, not just medically. I told myself I was projecting, that I was scared and looking for something steady to hold on to, and I was confusing kindness for connection. Doctors are trained to be warm. That's what they do. It's the job. I went back to work and tried to believe that the cardiology appointment was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, Dr. Webb had prescribed a low dose of blood pressure medication and a vitamin D supplement. And he asked me to come back in for a follow-up before I saw the cardiologist. I want to check in with you, he said. Make sure you're doing okay with everything? That follow-up appointment was on a Friday afternoon. The clinic was quieter at the end of the week. The toddler with the blocks wasn't there. The jazz was still playing. I sat in the same exam room and waited, and when Dr. Webb walked in, he looked, I don't know how to explain this, he looked like he'd had a long week. Not defeated, but a little worn at the edges. Human, in a way I hadn't seen before. He asked how I was doing. I told him I'd been anxious. He asked what helped when I was anxious, and I told him I walked Biscuit, my dog, usually along the lakefront path, and that helped more than anything. He smiled at that, a real unguarded smile, and told me he ran along that same path in the mornings. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary thing, but it cracked something open between us. He checked my blood pressure. It was already slightly lower, which he said was a good sign. Then he sat back on his stool and asked, "How are you really doing?" Not just physically. Nobody asks that. Not like that. Not in a place where the clock is always running and the next patient is always waiting. And maybe it was the fear in my heart, or the fact that I'd been carrying too much alone for too long. Or maybe it was just him, but I told him the truth. I told him I'd been lonely, that I'd ended a relationship about a year ago that I thought was going to be the one, and that I hadn't really let myself process how much that had knocked me sideways. I told him that I poured myself into work and into Biscuit, and into being the reliable friend who held everyone else together, and that somewhere in all of that, I'd forgotten to check in on myself. that maybe that was why I'd put off the checkup for 2 years, because checking in on myself felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. He was very still while I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think a lot of people do that. Build a life around avoiding the room that needs the most attention. Do you do that?" I asked, and I don't know where the question came from. It was too personal for that room, for that context, for that stethoscope around his neck. He looked at me for a moment, and something moved across his face carefully. "More than I'd like to admit," he said. I left that appointment feeling like I was walking slightly off the ground. Over the next month, I saw him twice more before my cardiology results were finalized. The cardiologist, a kind, precise woman named Dr. Anand, confirmed that I had a condition called supraventricular tachycardia, which sounds terrifying, but which she described as very manageable with lifestyle changes. Monitoring, and in some cases, a minor procedure if necessary, she was optimistic. She said I was lucky it had been caught. I texted that word to my mom. "Lucky," she cried. Dana took me out for dinner and held my hand across the table and told me I was not allowed to scare her like that again. And through all of it, Dr. Webb stayed in the loop. He called after my cardiology appointment to go over the findings with me. He sent a follow-up message through the clinic's patient portal, checking in on how I was feeling about the diagnosis. He was thorough and professional, and every single interaction was appropriate and measured. And I absolutely knew that I was developing feelings for this man, and that there was nothing I could do that was more inadvisable. He was my doctor. That was the beginning and the end of it. I told Dana. I sat across from her at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and I told her everything: how he looked, how he talked, how he remembered the things I told him and asked about them the next time, how he'd said he ran the same lakefront path I walked Biscuit on, and how I'd started going earlier in the mornings with the completely irrational hope of running into him. Dana looked at me with that face she makes, the one that's equal parts sympathy and amusement, and said, "James, sweetheart, you have fallen for your cardiologist's referral. He's a general practitioner," I said. "Oh yes, that's the important detail here." I laughed, and then I pressed my face into my hands and said, I know I'm not going to do anything. He's my doctor. It's completely inappropriate, and I'm just going to let it pass." "Has it passed?" she asked. I looked up at her. "No," I said. She refilled my coffee and said, "Tell me more about the lakefront path." It was the second week of December when it happened. I was walking Biscuit on a Saturday morning earlier than usual, before the path got crowded, when the lake was still dark and the city was just waking up. The air was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that makes everything feel very awake and very real. Biscuit was trotting ahead of me on his leash, nose down, investigating every inch of frozen ground, and then I saw him. He was running toward me from the other direction, wearing a dark green jacket and gray running pants, earbuds in, breath making small clouds in the cold air. He wasn't looking up at first, and I had about 4 seconds to decide what to do. I could have looked away. I looked at my phone, pretended I hadn't seen him, given us both the comfortable fiction of not having met outside the context where we made sense. Instead, I stopped walking and waited. And when he looked up and saw me, he pulled out his earbuds, and his face broke into a smile. Not the careful professional smile from the office, but something easier and more surprising. "Ch," he said. "Dr. Webb," I said. He laughed a little, slowing to a stop. Biscuit immediately went for him, and he crouched down without hesitation and let Biscuit sniff his hands and then scratch him behind the ears. And Biscuit, my usually discerning, occasionally suspicious dog, leaned into him like they were old. "Friends, this must be Biscuit," he said. "You told you his name?" I said. "You told me," he said, looking up. "The first time you came in," he remembered that. He'd remembered that from almost 3 months ago. We walked for a bit. I don't know whose idea it was. It wasn't really anyone's. It just happened the way things happen when neither person walks away. He fell into step beside me, and Biscuit trotted between us, and we talked. Not about my health, about the city, about the lake in winter, about what it was like to grow up here versus arriving and choosing to stay. He was from Atlanta originally. He'd come to Chicago for his residency and fallen in love with the city in a way that made leaving feel impossible. I told him I was from a small town in Indiana and that Chicago had been my escape hatch, the place I ran to when I needed to become someone different from who I'd been. Did it work, he asked. Mostly, I said. I think you always carry a little bit of where you came from. The question is whether it weighs you down or holds you steady. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lake. Then he said, That's a good way to think about it. We reached a fork in the path where he would have to turn back to complete his run, and I would continue toward my usual turnaround point. We stopped there, and the moment stretched out between us, full of something that neither of us named. He said, James, I need to say something, and I want to say it carefully. My heart, my slightly misfiring supraventricular tachycardia, heart kicked hard against my ribs. Okay, I said. He looked at me directly, the way he always did, that unwavering attention I'd come to think of as entirely his. I'm going to transfer your care to my colleague, Dr. Patel. She's excellent, and you'll be in very good hands. I want to be transparent with you about why I'm doing that. He paused. Because I think it would be inappropriate for me to continue as your physician given that He stopped, and for the first time I watched him look for words. Given that I find myself looking forward to your appointments in a way that goes beyond professional concern. The lake was very quiet. Ah! A bird called somewhere far away. Biscuit sat down between us like a small, furry mediator. I said, I've been walking this path at 7 in the morning every day for the past 3 weeks. He looked at me. Not usually a morning person, I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Slowly, and then all the way. I know, he said. I've been running earlier. We stood there on that frozen path with the gray December sky opening up above us and something enormous and terrifying and wonderful settling into place between us. And I thought about how strange it is, how genuinely, impossibly strange that a routine checkup, a thing I had put off for 2 years out of some combination of avoidance and fear and ordinary human inertia, led me here. To this path, to this man, to this moment where everything felt like the beginning of something I hadn't known I was waiting for. I'd like to get coffee, he said. If that's something you'd want, yes, I said. That's something I'd want. Right. Got coffee that same morning at a small place on Fullerton that was warm and crowded and smelled like cinnamon. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window and talked for 3 hours. Not as patient and doctor. As two people who had been circling each other from a careful, professional distance and had finally been given permission to close it. His name was Marcus. He'd wanted to be a doctor since he was 9 years old, when his grandfather had a stroke, and he'd watched the medical team work and felt his word called. He'd done his undergrad at Morehouse, medical school at Northwestern, stayed in Chicago, and built his practice here. He lived in an apartment in Lakeview, not far from mine. He had a younger sister named Claire who he was fiercely devoted to, and who he said was the funnier sibling by a significant margin. He liked jazz. The clinic music wasn't a coincidence. He cooked when he was stressed and ran when he was restless and had a bookshelf full of novels. He read in the margins of a life that didn't always leave room for them. He asked about my design work, and I showed him some things on my phone, and he looked at them with genuine curiosity, asking questions that weren't polite questions but real ones. He asked about the relationship that had ended, not in a probing way, just with the openness that I'd come to recognize from him, the quality of his attention that made you feel like what you said actually mattered. I told him about James, who I'd dated for 3 years and loved deeply, but who had wanted something geographically and personally different from what I could offer, and how we'd ended things, not in fire, but in the slow, sad way of two people who care about each other but have stopped being right for each other. That kind of ending is its own kind of hard, Marcus said. It is, I said. No villain, no clean break. Just this gradual realization that you've been grieving something for a long time before it's officially over. He nodded slowly. We told. Me? He'd been in one serious relationship in his late 20s with a man named David, someone he'd met during his residency, and that it had ended when David moved to New York for work, and they'd tried long distance for a year and finally admitted that neither of them was happy. I threw myself into work after that, he said, which is probably the most predictable thing a doctor could do. Predictable doesn't mean wrong, I said. No, he said. But it can mean loneliness. Outside the window, Chicago moved at its Saturday. Pace, unhurried and bundled up. I watched a woman walk past with a very small dog wearing a sweater and biscuit.